Hi everyone, welcome to another Facebook Live. I'm Dr. Oscar Saralak. Today we've got a really sort of fantastic topic just around fathers and supporting fathers and other primary sort of caregivers in helping sort of support the mother. We're just going to wait for a few more people to join and then just make sure that this feed we had a few technical issues last time, so just making sure that's all good. Okay, so one of the things, it's probably one of the most common questions that I'm getting nowadays, and progressively so, is mothers just wanting some information and support around how they can help support their partners, and also just with some of the challenges and difficulties that they are experiencing with maybe their partner's not being on board, maybe their partner's not really understanding the challenges that they're experiencing, especially as a new mother, and also just sort of the social context of what's going on in terms of expectations, in terms of sort of support networks, in terms of just planning around sort of the postnatal time. So what I'm hoping to cover today is really just looking at some of the principles around what I think is important for fathers, and this is not meant to be exclusively around men necessarily. So a lot of this really applies to same-sex couples, and also with maybe other caregivers that may not be the father. But there's certainly and all these principles and advice sort of apply across the board, really. So, and it's a really important discussion. I don't think as a society and a culture we really give this enough credence and importance, and I just know how many fathers are really sort of struggling out there in terms of their role and in terms of how they would like to be supporting their partner, and they just and there's no blueprint for them. So I think one of the really important things when I start talking to fathers is around, ideally you just don't start with the here and the now and that sort of problem solving, as it were. I think it's really useful to zoom out a little bit and have a look at the full context, because any couple that are struggling, there's often a legacy, and there sometimes can be even intergenerational issues going on there. So one of the things I really encourage fathers to do is to try to get in touch with their own story around fatherhood, and that sort of really begins as a child. What your relationship was like with your father, were they there, were they an absent father, were they quite a disciplinarian type father? And I think it's really important to share those stories, and also to for the mother to understand I suppose the foundation from where her partner is operating from. It can be also very useful for the father to hear the mother's stories in terms of their relationship with their father. There's a lot of masculine trauma, certainly in our culture, and that can come from the absent father, that can come from quite superficial values around the masculine, or very perhaps patriarchal type father figures. So I think it's really important to to start that process. This work is always not, it certainly takes some care, and it's an ongoing process really, but it's so valuable. And I think in terms of what the gift that gives that father's children, that they are starting this work is incredibly important. So so we're starting with the father's own sort of story with their father, and understanding a little bit about where that father got their ideas around masculinity, and that often starts from really young. I certainly know with my experience growing up at school and at high school, a lot of what I learned about masculinity was by default. Being a man meant not being a sissy, not being a puff, not being a wuss, not crying. I mean, there weren't many things that you were in terms of a man, all these things that you weren't. And so you can be stumbling around looking for meaning there. And I think it's also really useful to explore your role models that you had during your life. So not only your own father, but any other father figures that you may have had, uncles, grandfathers, neighbors, teachers, sports coaches, those kind of things, and really just starting to explore perhaps the positive and the negative aspects of each of those interactions that you had. And I think that can really sort of provide incredible foundation. There are lots of books and workshops that are really looking at this as a starting point. And certainly in terms of resources, and I think probably one resource that I recommend all men read, and all fathers who are thinking about being fathers or who are already fathers, is Stephen Biddulph's book. Let's have a look here. So and Stephen Biddulph is an Australian author, and he's done a lot of really amazing work. And he wrote this book about manhood many years ago, and it's recently been updated to the new manhood. And I think what's beautiful about this is that he really uses story, uses examples, and he has not necessarily exercises, but as much as sort of contemplation points, if you like, around things that fathers can sort of look at. It's a really fantastic sort of starting point, and it really asks some very important questions, especially around your relationship with your own father and starting that process of reconciliation and forgiveness. If there has been trauma or things that haven't been ideal in that sort of relationship. And I think another important aspect around fatherhood is this idea of enrollment. I see so many fathers who aren't fully enrolled in terms of that perhaps they were not ready to become fathers, maybe they didn't want to, and they were doing it much more for their partner, and they're sort of more passively in that role of a father rather than sort of being active. And so I think this idea of enrollment is also part of why there may be conflict, because if a father's not fully enrolled, they'll be engaging in a very sort of different way, and often and not turning up in the way that they potentially can, and not in a fully sort of supportive way. And I know that's very frustrating for fathers as well, to be doing something that's sort of a bit half-hearted and being lost in between those sort of two spaces of their pre-father self and not fully enrolling into their father being. I think the world of men's issues has lagged behind feminine issues, but there is certainly much more being sort of talked about it in recent sort of decades, and I think we're starting to see more men's groups. I think we're starting to see more positive, healthy discussion amongst men, and I've certainly had many incredible discussions at birthday parties or at my children's school, just regarding this new manhood, and in terms of how I think now in Australia 10% of fathers are actually the primary caregiver, whereas a generation ago the number would have been very, very low. And I think something that's worthwhile for men to be aware of, especially if they're curious and want to do sort of more work, is this idea around archetypes. And archetypes are something that, from a legend and tradition point of view, have been talked about a lot. And many of our stories that we understand around heroes and knights and those kind of things have a lot of these archetypes at play. And there are many archetypes, but when you hear people doing men's workshops or in a lot of the psychology literature, there are 4 main archetypes that are talked about, and there's sort of a positive aspect to that archetype and a negative aspect to that archetype. And I think what can be really useful for both mothers and for the fathers is to actually be able to look at those archetypes and see their behavior within that archetypal role. And I think once you kind of understand what is the shadow side of those archetypes, when you're trying to really step into the role, it can be very useful to sort of to shed light on that and to then maybe choose a more healthy behavior. And anyone who's interested, I think a good starting book is Moore and Gillette. They've done this fantastic book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, rediscovering the archetypes of the mature masculine. And they're the 4 main types of archetypes that are sort of talked about, and each one of these has the positive and also the shadow aspect to it. And so in an example of, say, the warrior archetype, in its negative, maybe the father just spending all his time at work, and that behavior would be considered to be part of the warrior archetype, but in the shadow form. And the lover archetype, also the sulking male, when there's behavior around sulking, especially around time with his partner, that's considered to be the shadow side of the lover archetype. But on the positive side, healthy play with his children is considered to be a really positive aspect of that lover archetype, and losing himself in play with his children, for example. So, and I think the nice thing about these types of books is they often have lots of story. They often talk about a lot of legends that we would know from sort of childhood, and it's not necessarily talking directly in any sort of judgmental way, and it can be just a great discussion point for couples and for the individual to use to reframe and look at your individual sort of situation. What are some of the common challenges that I sort of hear? I think one of the universal challenges is around lack of preparation, and this is both for mothers and fathers. There was some research from the United States that I saw a number of years ago saying that the average couple in America spends more time researching the buying of a new car than they do of becoming a parent. I'm not too sure if that's the case in Australia, but it's a point and example in terms of there's often quite a lot of discussion and work around the antenatal period, but certainly very little afterwards. And so I think this is a big hole both for mothers, but certainly fathers can feel very unprepared for what's going on, and essentially they're often really lagging behind. So this sort of lag period, the mother during pregnancy is having lots of these hormones and brain upgrades, as I've mentioned in previous talks, and so she's already starting that biological process. And the biological process, for a father, from what little research there's been done, that doesn't actually really start till the birth of the child, and then and the father's forever trying to sort of catch up is sort of the typical stereotype around that. What they do know around those biological changes is around the time of the birth there can be quite significant hormonal changes, and I think this is why it's so important to empower fathers to be involved with the antenatal time and then be involved with the birth, and then also be ideally empowered to be running the postnatal time. But if the father's present at birth, what the research shows is that his testosterone on average will go down about 30%, making him more placid, I suppose, would be one way of saying that, and more of a homebody in terms of what testosterone does. His prolactin, interestingly, goes up, and that's considered to be a hormone of lactation, as the name would sort of suggest. But in men, prolactin goes up, and I think that also helps with social bonding. And some recent research that I came across shows that there's a significant increase in oxytocin levels. And oxytocin, again, is that hormone of trust and connection, such an important thing for that family unit to be having. But they can actually see that when they're doing sort of blood tests. So again, if you're... so this idea of the lack of preparation can really hit couples like a freight train in terms of then trying to do crisis management as opposed to pre-planned parenting. And so any couples that are thinking about pregnancy who are pregnant but maybe don't have children, or who are thinking about planning more for that postnatal time, I think it's such an incredibly useful thing to do, to really invest time, discussion into talking about parenthood and talking around the postnatal plan. And as you'll often hear me say, if the father can be at home for as long as possible after the birth of their child, and I'm seeing more and more men taking 4, 6, 8 weeks, and that's I think an incredible gift to the mother and to the family, and an incredible gift that the father gives themselves as well, to really be able to connect and be part of that family, rather than perhaps feeling as an outsider, which I think I hear very often, especially when the father's not present at the birth, and then they're straight back to work. And there can be quite an alienating experience of, they can sense the baby bubble, they can sense the changes in the mother, but they don't really know what's going on, and they don't know how to be in there sharing with that, and then that can really lead to a sense of disconnection. I've often heard the joke that two's company and three's a crowd, and this idea that my wife now has a new lover and it's the baby, and I've heard that joke a number of times, and it's really reflecting, I think, the angst that fathers sort of feel about that of confusion, I suspect, and of alienation. And so that disconnection, I think, is can be sort of very tragic, and especially if there are masculine sort of trauma issues, it can mean a lot of suffering, not only for the father but for that sort of family unit. And I think that disconnection can also lead to resentment, and resentment, I find time and time again, is one of the crucial things that cause marital distress. It causes an incredible amount of conflict and arguments. And now the resentment can sort of be both ways, but one of the things that I think can happen is that the father can feel a lot of unconscious, unnamed, and maybe even unaware of the resentment that they're feeling around the fact that they may be having to work and doing longer hours, that they're not really acknowledged for what they're doing. There really may be resentment for the fact that they don't understand what's going on at home. The mother's there with the child, and why isn't the house clean? Why isn't meals cooked? I hear this sort of sentiment a lot in terms of this. And resentment really erodes away at many things, including someone's own self-confidence, in terms of the trust factor within the relationship. And it can really be like a cancer that just slowly spreads, causing further problems. And I think especially if either mother or father are feeling that there's a lot of resentment in terms of interactions and what's going on, it's so important to get help, so you can slowly start improving and healing that relationship rather than it sort of slowly getting worse. I think another common challenge is this idea of shifting from romantic love to mature love. And romantic love, as the name suggests, is spontaneous, often high libido, or quite carefree, and men, not always, but men often will have a higher libido than women, and that can cause a bit of a mismatch anyway. And then when a mother is all consumed with her baby, when she's touched out, which is a term to describe being in physical contact with her baby all day, that she really doesn't have that space, energy to be in that sort of physical, intimate space in the same way anyway that with her partner that she may have been previously. And I think that can further alienate the father, and really and this is something that's very important to be named. It's very important to be discussed and to try to work out some solutions, and not let that just fester unspoken. And I think part of what I was saying before about those masculine roles is really moving into that, or the archetypes is really moving into that mature love, and really embracing it rather than coming into that in resenting it or not really wanting it to be that way. The other thing that I often see as challenges as dynamics within the relationship get really amplified. And so things that may have been quite small and almost perhaps a little bit sort of humorous can really become much larger things after the birth of the child. One thing I sometimes hear is the frustration that mothers have around the partner's need to be right, and whether it be around anything from parenting gadgets such as the baby chair in the car, or around anything to do with parenting or anything outside of parenting. It's sometimes so great just to leave your agenda aside and go, well, look, even if you feel that you're right or don't, it's really important not to have feed the need to want to have to express that. And at the end of the day, when you're working as a we, it's really not that important about who's more correct. And I think that can really cause so many flashpoints within relationships. And if it means swallowing one's pride, if it means kind of reframing things, or even just coming back at a later point and saying, look, this thing happened earlier today. I didn't really want to talk about it at the time because I could see there was some friction, but it upset me, or I really wanted to talk about this particular point that, and I think it can be so great to really discuss those. I think one of the things that can happen is that many people feel that when the heat is on, there's a flashpoint that they really need to sort it out then and there. And sometimes, especially if you have a super tired mother who may be having some of these cognitive challenges that we're aware of in terms of baby brain, those kind of things, sometimes it's best to wait for things to sort of cool down, let the emotions simmer, and then the couple can reconnect and have a much more healthy discussion and have a much better chance of actually working out what that issue was, rather than it kind of flipping back onto previous relationship dynamics and in that sort of whirlpool of arguments that many couples sort of know. And I think the other common challenge that I see often is around this idea of role confusion. What is it that I'm meant to do as a dad? What is it that I'm meant to be doing now as a partner? And many men and caregivers won't necessarily name that. They may not actually be clear that that's going on and that they're feeling challenged and compromised. And I think this is why, like I said, coming back to those principles and archetypes and looking at one's own story and then reflecting on your role models can be such a healthy, useful place to sort of go when there is being a challenge there. So ideally what would be happening is older men talking to that younger man who's struggling with his role, and again in that idea of deep support and non-judgment, and potentially just with sharing stories rather than this advice of this is what you should be doing. Can sometimes be so useful, not only just to feel that the man, he's being heard and he's being cared about, but also that he is not alone, and that that I think this whole idea of investing time and effort into those places that are perhaps uncomfortable, those places where there may be trauma lurking or fear of the unknown. I think these older men, father figures, they have such an important role in that. And I think one of the things I'd love to see, I'm hearing it more and more, is just as mothers have a blessing way or a baby shower during the pregnancy, that men are being sort of taken by their male friends who may be fathers or not, but at least kind of been honoured in their journey, and also again the sharing of story and maybe some sage advice around things to be aware of, things to be trying to navigate. And I had a similar experience with a very good friend of mine who took me for a walk through the bush. He wasn't a father himself, but he certainly thought that it was important to get me one-on-one out of the routine as well. So, and then sort of shoulder to shoulder as we were going on this several-hour walk, some interesting discussions came up about how I was feeling, about how my friend was seeing the situation, and just about how where I was prepared, where I was feeling challenged, and again, I remember having that experience of, wow, like I'm actually being held here, and even though I don't feel any particularly much clearer about my role as a father, I really felt that the support, and that if I needed to not only go to that particular friend but other friends to talk about issues, that I felt that had really engaged that conversation. I came across a quote recently that I really like, and I'm not too sure how to pronounce this gentleman's surname. I don't know if it's John Wooden or John Woden. He is quite a famous basketball coach in America. He was actually called, I think, the most important coach of the 20th century in America within sort of basketball. And he was certainly very known for a lot of his life advice and quotes and those kind of things. And this quote is, "The best thing a father can do for his children is to love their mother." And I think what is beautiful about that comment is, yes, there is a lot of wisdom in that, but it's also, again, around this sort of role confusion. It's like, okay, what is my role? Especially in those early times, I think there can be such an emphasis on I have to be looking after the baby and doing it 50-50, or getting really kind of getting my hands in there with the childcare. And that's certainly very useful, but that's not necessarily his primary task, especially in those first weeks. And so when I talk about postnatal planning with fathers, one of the principles I talk about is that they are the guardian of that house, and they're the guardian of that family, and especially whilst they're in that kind of baby bubble, to really be policing everything that's coming in and out of the house, and really be empowered to enact their postnatal plan, whatever that looks like, and not to be always falling back to the mother of, oh, what do we sort of do here, and so if we have got a postnatal plan before the birth of the child, that's agreed upon by mother, father, and any other sort of caregivers that may sort of be involved, and there may be sort of food rosters, there may be sort of job lists of sort of people to do, and really some principles around not having visitors coming into the house who are there sort of needlessly or staying too long. And I think that can be very empowering for the father, and also just to have that written down as a verbal memorandum of understanding about what this time should look like, I think can be very, very useful as well. Men tend to do really well with tasks, and maybe not so well with principles. And so, again, it's a stereotype, but I think there is validity to that. And so, wherever there is a principle, there needs to be an example or task associated with it. And I think that can be really useful. So, job allocation, or having the message as clear as possible. I think there also needs to be a lot of humour in the situation as well, and part of the archetype of the magician is also around not necessarily being a comedian, but really just bringing in that energy of soft humour and laughter and play into not only with the children, but also with his partner. and I'm really liking the more and more things that I'm kind of seeing out there that really speak of that. This whole idea of hashtag do it like a dad, where I suppose we're celebrating the fact that men often will do things differently, to maybe a different standard than what mothers like, and rather than that being perhaps criticised or a point of frustration, maybe we should be celebrating that. And I think mothers also need to really perhaps step back at times and allow the father to find his feet and to find his flavour and his way of doing things. And I think not only is that fantastic for the father, but I think the child can really then be engaging with their father with a different role model and a different sort of way of doing things, and I think that can be very, very healthy. A book I came across a while ago, just in terms of that humour vein. Not that I'm necessarily recommending it, but I think it certainly ended up generating a lot of traffic online. And this book here, How to Dad, by the How to Dad bloke, and it's not just humorous. I think there are some things that are kind of useful from a parenting point of view, but it really highlights that humorous journey that a stay-at-home dad has sort of gone through. And I think, again, there's so much healing in the funny side of things. And so we've already sort of covered a lot of the what to do aspects, potentially in terms of the archetypes, getting in touch with your own sort of father story, and around some of the principles around sort of postnatal care and what have you. And I think this idea of resources in education is so important. And my good friend Sean Tonnett, who's a relationship counsellor, he often talks about this under-resourced male. And the under-resourced male is the father who, either through life experience, through direct role modelling, or through just lack of preparation, goes into that fatherhood time not prepared, and how they can flounder. And that floundering can sometimes manifest in many ways, but always, often towards a shadow figure. So it may staying at work just to avoid being at home, addiction behaviours, drinking, or going back to behaviours of pre-parenthood in terms of going out with your mates, long fishing trips, and behaving essentially as if your role hasn't changed very much. And so that is unsatisfying for the father, and certainly causes a huge amount of distress for the mother. So in terms of other resources, we've talked about some of the books that I often recommend that I quite like. I might just show you a couple of other books that can sort of be useful. If dads are kind of struggling in their parenting role, anything by Stephen Biddulph I think is fantastic. This is an old version of his Raising Boys. Raising Girls, fantastic book as well. There are new additions to those, and he also has books such as The Secret to Happy Children, and I think there can be just lots of really useful pearls in there that a struggling father is probably desperately sort of needing. For fathers who and again, this is a fantastic book by our local Dr. Anna Rubinstein, who does the rites of passage. The making of men, I think, is especially with an older boy sort of heading into teenagehood, this is gold, this book. And so anyone who can attend one of Dr. Rubenstein's rites of passage with their 14, 15, 16-year-old boy. I think that can be a life-changing experience in terms of that part of the fatherhood journey. In terms of just another book from Stephen Biddulph, Stories of Manhood. Again, just a lot of readers have shared stories from his book New Manhood, and it's just a collation of books. It's quite a nice one to read. This is a little bit dated, but it's a compilation of essays around manhood, and edited by Keith Thompson. But there's a gold mine of just essays and commentary by some very sort of famous people. If anyone's interested in looking at sort of the sacred masculine, looking at those archetypes, I think a good starting point is Robert Bly's Iron John. This is probably the first major book that came out in the West regarding sort of the New Age masculinity, and it's basically a exploration of a legend, and then really bringing some narrative to it. Anything by Robert Johnson as well. He's a fantastic author that from a Jungian point of view, really talks about these sort of archetypes using really famous legends such as the Holy Grail as an example. In terms of there are a number of books out there. I don't particularly recommend this book over other books, but this book's quite useful in terms of just knowing the nuts and bolts information around what the hell's going on in the first 12 months after the birth of the child, just from a physical, emotional point of view, sleep point of view, from the baby's point of view, also from the mother's point of view. And this is quite accessible. I mean, some of the books I find are perhaps quite detailed, whereas the New Father, A Dad's Guide to the First Year by Armin Brott, it can be a really nice flick through. I need to know something about this, or my child's not sleeping, we're thinking about using a dummy, I'm totally out of my depth. This can be a nice sort of starting point. For dads wanting to know more around skilling up perhaps on home issues, this is an old edition, but this is a fantastic resource, I think, for all families, but dads can really get their sort of teeth into this. Healthy Home, Healthy Family by our own Nicole Bilgemer. She's down in Melbourne, and so this is a book around everything from electricity to water filters to cosmetics to use of phones and much more. And so if there's any confusion around these issues, this is a very trustworthy, science-heavy, but very practical guide. And she's got her third edition out now, so that's in terms of relationship sort of support. Obviously, always seeing a counsellor, a therapist, a psychologist, I think can be very useful, but that can be quite confronting. And sometimes whilst waiting for that to happen, or just to get some sort of inspiration, there are a few things I'll sometimes recommend. I think John Gray he's a very interesting author who's been writing a lot about this. I actually wouldn't recommend this book because it's really dated, but anything that he's done recently in the last 5 years, I think can be really sort of useful. The Queen's Code is another book that I think can sometimes be useful. I can't remember the author. And then this is quite a famous book, Nonviolent Communication, Marshall Rosenberg. I think this can be quite a useful book when in terms of just setting up a set of rules and a playing field, so to speak, when couples are arguing a lot and they go to that point of anger and disconnection very quickly. Another book that I'll sometimes recommend, especially for any couples who are wanting to understand more around the common manifestations of the shadow energy of those archetypes. Why Dads Leave, and this is by Meryl Callender, I think you'd pronounce that. No, it's not the most cheerful book, but it's certainly really is a very brave book, and how it goes and talks about some very problematic areas, and it starts to explore the why, and then also has very useful stuff around the what to do about it. And then just one resource that I recommend online. I'm not a great sort of website person, so I'm sure there are many, many good online resources out there. But in Australia, we have mensline.org.au, an incredible amount of resources on there. And I think that can also be a fantastic starting point for couples or for men feeling out of their depth. So I might answer a few questions now. That was quite a long session, so thanks for bearing with me, but there's so much to talk about with this topic. And I certainly intend to be doing more videos looking at each of those sections in much more detail. So lots of comments, thank you. And if anyone does have any questions, please send them to Facebook. I'm really sort of happy to answer them at another time. Thank you for listening in to this very important topic. And as a father, as someone who deals a lot with the struggles of mothers and who talks to a lot of other fathers about their struggles, this is such an incredibly important topic. And I think even just beginning the work now, you don't have to be perfect as a father, as long as you're committed to trying to improve as a father, as long as you're really understanding the transformation that of becoming a father, and that it requires just ongoing work and just touching base on a regular basis with other men, with your resources, with your partner. So thank you, and we'll see you next week.